The maid hides her pregnancy from the millionaire boss, fearing she will be fired, but the delicate clink of china echoed through the corridors of the Sterling mansion as Wren Cooper almost dropped the tea tray she was carrying. Her hands trembled not from the weight of the antique piece of English porcelain, but from the secret that had been growing silently in her womb for 12 weeks. Sterling looked up from his papers when he heard the sound, meeting his housekeeper's startled gaze. "Is everything all right, Wren?" he asked in that deep voice that still filled her dreams every night. "Perfectly, Mr. Sterling," she replied automatically, balancing the tray and pouring the Earl Grey tea that he drank religiously at 4 in the afternoon in his office at the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The routine had been the same for 2 years, ever since Wren had taken over as the estate's head housekeeper. What was a routine was the way her heart raced every time Heath looked at her with those intense blue eyes, or the way her skin still tingled when she remembered that one night in the winter garden, 3 months ago. Heath watched as she poured the tea with her usual grace, noticing something different in her movements, a subtle hesitation that didn't match her usual efficiency. At 38, he had built an empire in the real estate market by being observant, and something about his 28-year-old housekeeper was definitely changed. "Madison called earlier today," Heath commented casually, referring to his sister. "She mentioned that you turned down the invitation to the charity dinner this weekend." Wren nervously adjusted the apron of her impeccable uniform, trying to disguise the slight bulge that was beginning to form in her abdomen. "I thought it more appropriate to keep a professional distance, sir." "After 2 years, Wren, I thought we'd outgrown these formalities," he replied, a trace of disappointment in his voice. The comment took her back to that night in March, when an unexpected storm surprised them in the winter garden. Heath had just received the news that his latest fertility treatment had failed. The chance meeting, the words of comfort exchanged, the reassuring touch that turned into something deeper, it all came back with full force to her memory. "Things have changed," she muttered, more to herself than to him. He stood up from his mahogany desk, approaching her with deliberate steps. "What exactly has changed, Wren?" She stepped back instinctively, her fingers clenching the tray as if it were a shield. "I should check the menu with Mrs. Patterson for tomorrow's dinner." "Dinner can wait," Heath insisted, gently removing the tray from her hands and placing it on the side table. "Something's been wrong for weeks. You barely look me in the eye, you avoid being alone with me, and now you're refusing invitations that you've always accepted in the past." His woody scent enveloped her, bringing up memories she struggled daily to suppress. How could she tell him the truth? How could she explain that she carried the miracle he so desired? The fruit of a single night of shared vulnerability. "Mr. Sterling." "Heath," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just trying to keep things professional." "Is it because of that night?" he asked directly, his eyes searching hers. "Because if you're sorry—" "No," the word escaped with more force than she had intended. "It's not regret." The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted them, and Wren took the opportunity to move away. Madison Sterling, Heath's younger sister, appeared in the office doorway, her high heels echoing on the marble floor. "Heath, you won't believe what—" "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I interrupting something?" "No, Miss Sterling," Wren replied quickly. "I was just leaving." Before either of the brothers could protest, she hurried out of the office, her heart pounding wildly. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her hands instinctively finding her belly. How could she continue to hide her pregnancy? Heath believed he was sterile due to an accident in his youth, and this certainty had led him to years of failed treatments and shattered hopes. Now, the miracle he had longed for was happening, but in the most complicated circumstances possible. From the office door, muffled voices reached her. Madison was animatedly discussing the preparations for the benefit dinner for the Sterling Foundation, set up by Heath in memory of his parents, who died in an accident when he was just 18. Wren knew she had to make a decision. Every day that passed made it harder to hide her condition, and working so closely with the man she secretly loved was becoming torture. But the thought of leaving Sterling Manor, of getting away from Heath, made her heart clench painfully. Straightening her shoulders, she made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson, the elderly chef who was practically a second mother to her, was preparing dinner. The aroma of fresh herbs and red wine sauce would normally comfort her, but at that moment, it only intensified her persistent morning nausea. "Darling, you look as pale as a ghost," Mrs. Patterson commented, abandoning her preparations to approach Wren. "I'm fine," she tried to smile, but her eyes filled with treacherous tears. The elderly chef gently led her to a chair, placing a cup of ginger tea in front of her. "When do you intend to tell him?" Wren looked startled at the gray-haired lady. "How? Darling, I've raised 3 children. I recognize the signs," she smiled gently. "And I've seen how you and Mr. Sterling have been looking at each other for months. That night in the winter garden wasn't as secret as you think." Mrs. Patterson's words made Wren realize that a secret might not be as well kept as she thought. In a house the size of the Sterling mansion, the walls had eyes and ears, and the senior staff, like the chef, were keen observers. "He deserves to know," Mrs. Patterson continued softly. "Mr. Sterling is a good man, Wren. Give him the chance to do the right thing." But what would the right thing be? Wren asked himself, sipping the tea that was helping to calm his upset stomach. Tell the truth and risk losing not only his job, but also Heath's respect? Or leave before the truth came out, protecting her already fragile heart? Upstairs, Heath Sterling looked out of his office window at the winter garden where his life had changed irrevocably 3 months ago. Something was happening to Wren, something she refused to share, and for the first time in years, he felt he was about to lose something truly precious, even if he didn't know exactly what. Madison Sterling was not known for her discretion, and her chance meeting with Wren in Heath's office had aroused his natural curiosity. As she walked through the halls of the mansion the next morning, her heels echoing against the Italian marble, she watched the housekeeper with a new interest. "Something's definitely different," Madison murmured to herself, noticing how Wren let out a small moan as she bent down to pick up a fallen book from a library. The scene didn't go unnoticed by Heath, who was standing in the doorway. His face showed genuine concern when he saw Wren's discomfort, but before he could approach, his housekeeper had already disappeared through the side door. "Have you noticed that she looks different?" Madison asked, adjusting her designer glasses as she approached her brother. Heath ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture his sister knew well. It had been his nervous tic since he was a teenager. "She's been distant for the last few weeks." "Weeks?" Madison arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "Or would that be 3 months, to be more precise?" Heath's sharp glance at his sister was enough to confirm his suspicions. Madison had always had a sixth sense for romantic drama, especially when it involved her older brother. "What happened that night in the winter garden, Heath? How did you—" "Please," she rolled her eyes. "The walls of this house have ears, and Mrs. Patterson is an excellent source of information when well fed with my compliments on her apple pie." Heath sank into one of the leather armchairs in the library, his normally impeccable posture giving way to the weight of the memories of that night. It was just a moment of connection. Madison sat down in the opposite armchair. "Is that what billionaires call it these days?" "Don't be vulgar, Madison," he scolded her, but there was a discreet blush on his neck. "Wren was there when I got the results of the last treatment. She understood me in a way that no one else could." Madison watched her brother carefully. In her 35 years of life, she had rarely seen him so vulnerable. Ever since the accident that took his parents' lives and left Heath with after effects that compromised his fertility, he had shut himself up in an almost impenetrable emotional fortress. "And now she's avoiding you," Madison added softly. "Have you considered that there might be a bigger reason for this?" Before Heath could answer, the sound of breaking glass echoed from the hallway, followed by a small scream. The Sterling brothers rushed out of the library, finding Wren leaning against the wall, shards of an antique vase scattered at her feet. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her face paler than usual. "I felt a bit dizzy," and her words were interrupted when her legs were weak. Heath caught her before she fell, his strong arms wrapping around her protectively. "Call Dr. Reynolds," he ordered his sister, who was already holding the phone. "It's not necessary," Wren protested weakly, but her body trembled in Heath's arms. "It's not a suggestion, Wren." His voice was gentle but firm as he carried her upstairs to her room. Wren's room, although modest by the mansion's standards, reflected her personality. Books neatly arranged on the shelves, a small vase with fresh flowers on the bedside table, and a handmade quilt on the bed, gifts from Mrs. Patterson over the years. He laid it gently on the bed, his hands reluctant to leave it. "Why didn't you tell me you were ill?" Wren closed her eyes, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not sick, Heath." The way she pronounced his name, soft and full of emotion, made his heart race. Before he could question her further, Dr. Reynolds arrived, accompanied by Madison. "Leave us alone, please," the doctor requested, placing his briefcase on the side table. Heath hesitated, his eyes fixed on Wren. "I'll be right outside." 20 minutes later, which seemed like an eternity to Heath, Dr. Reynolds came out of the room with a neutral expression that years in the profession had perfected. "How is she?" Heath asked immediately. The doctor adjusted his glasses, choosing his words carefully. "Physically, she's fine. It's a natural condition." Madison, who had remained silent until then, let out a small exclamation of understanding. "Oh my God, what's going on?" Heath demanded, his authoritative CO tone emerging instinctively. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but medical matters are confidential. I suggest he talk to Ms. Cooper." As the doctor left, Heath stared at the closed door of Wren's room, his heart hammering against his chest. Madison placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, brother," she said softly, "miracles happen when you least expect them." Heath looked at his sister, confusion and hope mixed in his blue eyes. "What do you mean?" Madison smiled enigmatically. "I think it's time you and Wren had a very serious talk about what really happened that night in the Winter Garden." With those words, she left him alone in the hallway, staring at the door that separated him not only from Wren, but possibly from the greatest miracle of his life. A heavy silence hung in the hallway as Heath stood motionless in front of Wren's bedroom door. Madison's enigmatic words echoed in his mind, along with Dr. Reynolds' carefully neutral observations. After a few moments that seemed eternal, he finally knocked softly on the door. "Wren," his voice came out softer than he had intended. "May I come in?" A moment's hesitation, then yes. He found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands intertwined over her lap in a way that now seemed terribly meaningful. The late afternoon light streamed in through the window, bathing the room in golden hues that highlighted the vulnerability on her face. "Dr. Reynolds says you're fine," Heath began, keeping a cautious distance. "But something tells me there's more to this story." Wren took a deep breath, mustering all the courage she could find. "You should sit down." Heath took the armchair next to the window, his eyes never leaving her face. It was then that he noticed the small details he had ignored over the last few weeks. The slight rounding of her cheeks, the different glow to her skin, the way her hands remained protectively on her belly. "I'm pregnant," she finally said, her voice just a whisper. The world seemed to stop for a moment. He felt his heart leap painfully in his chest as his mind processed the information. "But that's impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The doctor said, 3 months, Wren continued, silent tears streaming down her face. Since that night in the Winter Garden, the realization hit Heath like a wave, bringing with it a storm of emotions. Memories of that night flooded his mind. The rain beating against the glass roof, the scent of the orchids his mother loved so much, the comfort he found in Wren's arms when his last hopes of parenthood seemed to have collapsed. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You thought you were sterile," she replied, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "I didn't want you to think. I didn't want you to doubt. Of you?" He stood up, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Wren, I've known you for 2 years. You're the most honest and upstanding person I've ever met." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. The contact sent shivers through both their bodies, reminding them of the deep connection they shared that night in March. "But that's not all," Wren continued, her voice trembly. "I'm your employee, Heath. What will people think? What will happen to your reputation? To the Sterling Foundation? Do you think I care about that?" he asked, an incredulous smile forming on his lips. "Wren, you're telling me that the miracle I spent years looking for happened the night I finally gave up looking?" His words took her by surprise. In all the scenarios she had imagined for this revelation, she had never considered that Heath might receive the news with such joy. "But your social position? To hell with my social standing," he declared, a laugh escaping his lips. "You're carrying my child. Our child. A baby the doctor swore I could never have." The emotion in his voice made Wren's heart clench. She had always known that Heath would be a wonderful father. It was one of the reasons she had fallen in love with him. Seeing him so happy with the news made all her worries seem small in comparison. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," she whispered, gathering her courage. "What?" he asked, his hand still holding hers. "I love you." The words escaped before she could contain them. "Not just because of that night or the baby. I've loved you for a long time." The smile that lit up Heath's face was like the sunrise after a long night. "Wren Cooper, I've been trying not to fall in love with you since the day you rearranged my entire library in order of historical importance, rather than alphabetically, because he said it made more sense that way." A laugh escaped her lips, mixed with tears of relief and happiness. He stood up, gently pulling her with him. "It's not going to be easy," she warned, thinking of the headlines that were sure to follow. "People will talk." "Let them talk," he replied, one of his hands finding its way to her belly. "Everything I care about is right here." At that moment, soft knocks on the door interrupted them. Madison poked her head into the room, her knowing smile indicating that she had probably heard part of the conversation. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Patterson is threatening to come up in person if she doesn't hear from you. She's worried about her little girl and is apparently baking 3 different pies to calm her nerves." The comment broke the tension in the room, making everyone laugh. Mrs. Patterson was known for expressing her emotions through cooking. The more worried she was, the more elaborate her dishes became. "Tell her we're coming down," Heath replied, his eyes never leaving Wren's face. "We have an important announcement to make." Madison clapped her hands excitedly before disappearing, probably to spread the news to all the servants who, knowing the Sterling mansion, were already gathered in the kitchen waiting for news. "Are you sure?" Wren asked one last time, looking for confirmation in his eyes. Heath responded with a kiss, soft and full of promise. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." The twilight painted the room in shades of gold and pink as they walked to the door, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held together. After all, the greatest treasures really were right under their noses. They just needed the courage to recognize them. The buzz in the kitchen of the Sterling mansion was palpable as Heath and Wren walked down the stairs hand in hand. Mrs. Patterson, with flour up to her elbows and 3 different pies cooling on the counter, was the first to see them. Her experienced eyes immediately noticed the intertwined hands and the radiant glow on both their faces. "Finally!" exclaimed the elderly chef, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was thinking of locking you 2 in the pantry until you sorted this out." Madison, who was sitting on the high stool at the kitchen island, couldn't hold back a laugh. "I would have gladly helped with that plan." The news of Wren's pregnancy and her relationship with Heath spread quickly among the staff closest to the mansion. To the couple's surprise, the reaction was predominantly one of joy and acceptance. It was as if everyone had known for a long time what they themselves had been slow to admit. Mr. Sterling, Albert, the butler who had served the family for 3 decades, approached with his usual dignity. "Allow me to be the first to officially congratulate you. Your parents would be very proud." The mention of his parents made Heath squeeze Wren's hand lightly. "Thank you, Albert. That means a lot to me." In the middle of the congratulations, Heath's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was his executive assistant, reminding him of the board meeting scheduled for the following morning. "Reality is calling," he whispered to Wren. "We need to decide how we're going to deal with this publicly." "Leave that to me," Madison interjected, already holding her tablet. "No wonder I'm in charge of public relations for Sterling Enterprises." As Madison began to devise communication strategies, Wren felt a wave of dizziness. Mrs. Patterson immediately led her to a chair, placing a piece of freshly baked apple pie in front of her. "Eat," ordered the chef with motherly authority. "That baby needs proper nutrition." Heath watched the scene with a smile, his heart overflowing with love for the way his unconventional family was already coming together around Wren and the baby. However, A shadow of worry crossed his face at the thought of the complications to come. Later that evening, after the commotion had died down, Heath and Wren met again in the Winter Garden. The place that had witnessed the beginning of their story now seemed even more magical under the starlight. "I can't stop thinking about how everything has changed in a matter of hours," Wren commented, absent-mindedly stroking her belly as she settled down on one of the sofas. Heath sat down next to her, pulling her close. "It's changed for the better. But Wren, we need to talk about some practical things. Like the fact that I'm your employee." "Exactly," he confirmed. "I don't want you to leave your job. I know how much you love looking after this house. But I also don't want you to continue as my housekeeper when you're so much more than that." Wren bit her lip thoughtfully. "What do you suggest?" "The Sterling Foundation is growing. We need someone to oversee the social projects, someone with your keen eye for detail and your natural compassion." The proposal took her by surprise. "Do you think I'm qualified? You have a degree in business administration with an emphasis on social projects, Wren. I know you worked as a housekeeper because you needed stability after the death of your parents, but you're more than qualified to take on an executive position." The fact that he remembered the details of her academic background, something she had only mentioned once during a casual conversation a long time ago, warmed his heart. "What about the shareholders? The press? I don't want them to think I got the position by... well, you know." He'd held her face between his hands. "Madison is already working on it. We're going to do everything the right way, transparently. Besides, your CV speaks for itself." A movement at the entrance to the Winter Garden caught his eye. It was Albert, carrying a tray of tea and cookies. "Sorry to intrude," the butler said with a half-smile, "but Mrs. Patterson insists that Miss Cooper needs to eat regularly now." Wren couldn't help laughing. "I guess I ought to get used to that." "You certainly will," Heath agreed, taking the tray from Albert. "And speaking of getting used to it, there's another matter we need to discuss." He waited for Albert to leave before continuing. "I want you to move into the main wing of the mansion, not as an employee, but as my partner." Wren's heart raced. The main wing was Heath's private territory, where only family had access. Moving in would be a clear statement of his new status. "Isn't it too soon?" she asked, although her heart already knew the answer. "Wren," Heath smiled, placing his hand over hers on her belly. "We're having a baby together. Besides, I've spent the last 2 years trying not to admit that I fell in love with the woman who rearranged my life in so many different ways." His words made her blush. It was true. Since taking over as housekeeper, she had brought order not only to the mansion, but also to Heath's chaotic life. "All right," she finally agreed, "but on one condition." "What?" "That you let me keep my independence. I want to prove my worth in the foundation on my own merits." The pride in Heath's eyes was evident. "I wouldn't expect anything different from you. It's one of the reasons I love you." The sound of approaching heels announced Madison's arrival. "Sorry to interrupt the romantic moment, but we need to define the strategy for the public announcement. The press is already speculating about why Heath canceled tomorrow's board meeting." The reality of the outside world was beginning to seep into her bubble of happiness, but strangely, it didn't seem so scary anymore. With Heath by her side and the unexpected support of everyone at the mansion, Wren felt ready to face any challenge that came her way. The news of Wren's pregnancy and her relationship with Heath spread through Greenwich's social circles like wildfire through dry straw. Madison had organized an impeccable official statement, but that didn't stop the sharp tongues of high society from starting to speculate about the Sterling scandal. "Don't read that," Heath ordered, trying to pry the gossip magazine out of Wren's hands as they ate breakfast on the mansion's veranda a week after the announcement. "Too late," she replied, her eyes scanning the sensationalist headline. "Billionaire Heath Sterling involved with housekeeper? Swindle or love story?" At least they were creative with the headline. Heath frowned, but before he could reply, his phone rang. It was Richard Montgomery, chairman of the board of Sterling Enterprises and a close friend of his late parents. "Yes, Richard, I understand. I'll be there in an hour." Wren watched the tension build in Heath's shoulders as he ended the call. "Emergency board meeting? Some members are worried about the company's image," he explained, his voice laced with frustration. "Richard is on our side, but I need to face this personally. Do you want me to go with you?" Heath smiled, admiring his courage. "Not this time. I need to deal with these sharks on my own. As Heath prepared to leave, Wren decided to focus her energy on something productive. Madison had suggested that she start familiarizing herself with the Sterling Foundation's projects, and the mansion's library contained all the necessary files. It was among the mahogany bookcases that Eleanor Montgomery, Richard's wife and an old friend of Heath's mother, met Wren a few hours later. "I knew I'd find you here," Eleanor said, her elegant presence filling the room. "Richard told me about the council meeting. I thought you might want some company." Wren straightened in her chair, uncertain how to react. Eleanor Montgomery was an intimidating figure in the Greenwich social circle, known as much for her philanthropy as for her ruthless judgment. "That's very kind of you," Wren replied diplomatically. Eleanor approached, her experienced eyes noticing the documents on the table. "Foundation projects? Interesting choice of reading. Heath offered me a position overseeing social projects," Wren explained, fighting the urge to justify herself. "Yes, Madison told me." Eleanor sat down in a nearby armchair. "You know, I've known Heath's mother, Elizabeth, since college. She also started at the Sterling Foundation as a volunteer against the wishes of many." That caught Wren's attention. "I didn't know that." "Oh yes, Elizabeth was a teacher when she met Jonathan Sterling. It was a scandal at the time. The heir to the Sterling Empire falling in love with a simple high school teacher." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "But she proved her worth. She turned the foundation into what it is today." The revelation hit Wren like a ray of hope. How did she cope with all this? "With grace and determination," Eleanor replied, her tone softening. "And by having the right people by her side. Richard and I were there for her, just as we're here now for you and Heath." Unexpected tears welled up in Wren's eyes. "Why, you hardly know me." "I know you well enough." Eleanor stood up, adjusting her Chanel blazer. "I've seen how you've transformed this house over the last 2 years. How you look after not just the physical space, but the people. You're exactly the kind of person Elizabeth would have chosen for her son." The sound of doors opening interrupted the conversation. Heath entered the library, his face tired but determined. He stopped when he saw Eleanor. Eleanor," he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. "I didn't know you were here. I just stopped by to have a much-needed chat with you, Wren," she replied with a knowing smile. "Richard told me about the meeting. How did it go?" "Better than expected, thanks to his support." Heath relaxed visibly. "Some board members are still resistant, but most understand that my personal life doesn't affect my ability to lead." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, you two will be joining us for dinner on Saturday. It's not a request." After Eleanor left, Heath approached Wren, noticing her watery eyes. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor can be intense. "She told me about your mother," Wren explained, intertwining her fingers with his. "How she also faced resistance at first." Heath was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "My mother would have adored you," he finally said, his voice laced with emotion. "She always said that a person's true value lies in how they treat others, not in their social status." "I wish I'd known her," Wren whispered, unconsciously stroking his belly. "She's here, in a way," Heath replied, his eyes roaming the library. "In every book she chose, in every foundation project she started, and now, through the grandson or granddaughter she's never met, but whom I'm sure she already loves." The moment was interrupted by Madison, who entered carrying a stack of papers. "Excuse me, but we need to finalize the details of next month's charity event. It will be your first official public appearance as a couple." Wren felt a chill in her stomach, but the comforting squeeze of Heath's hand around her waist calmed her down. With the unexpected support of Eleanor Montgomery and the inspiring memory of Elizabeth Sterling, she felt stronger to face any challenge that came her way. "We're ready," she said, surprising herself with her confidence. Heath's proud smile lit up his face. Together, they began to plan not just an event, but their future. A future that, despite the shadows of the past and the challenges of the present, looked brighter every day. The Sterling Foundation's charity event was approaching, and with it Wren's anxiety was growing. Sitting in the office that had once belonged to Elizabeth Sterling, she reviewed the spreadsheets for the literacy project that would be launched during the dinner. Madison had insisted that she take over the main presentation, her first official appearance as the Foundation's Director of Social Projects. "You're frowning again," Heath commented from the doorway, making her jump slightly. The doctor said to avoid stress. "I'm pregnant, not disabled," she replied, but couldn't hold back a smile when he reached over to massage her tense shoulders. "We've received another important confirmation for the event," he mentioned casually. "Charlotte Astor." Wren froze. Charlotte Astor was practically royalty in Greenwich, and also Heath's ex-girlfriend, whom everyone had expected him to marry before their sudden breakup 3 years ago. Has she confirmed her attendance? With a date, Heath added quickly, noticing the tension in Wren's shoulders returning. "And before you start worrying, she was the one who broke up with me because I was emotionally unavailable." "And you were?" Wren couldn't help asking. He spun her around so that she was facing him. "Probably. I was so focused on proving my worth to the board, on making up for not being able to carry on the Sterling name in the traditional way, I didn't realize I was closing myself off to real connections. Until that night in the Winter Garden," she teased, trying to lighten the moment. "Actually," he smiled, "it was much earlier. It was when you rearranged my schedule to include a weekly lunch with Madison, saying that family was more important than any business meeting." The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Albert, carrying an elegant cream envelope. "Sorry to interrupt, but this arrived from Miss Cooper. Special courier." Wren opened the envelope, her face paling as she read the contents. Heath immediately noticed her change of mood. "What is it?" "It's from my Uncle Marcus," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He saw the news about us. He wants to meet me." Heath knew the story. Marcus Cooper had become Wren's legal guardian after her parents died in a car accident when she was 16. Their relationship was complicated. He had never approved of her decision to work as a governess, considering the business degrees she had earned. "Do you want me to go with you?" Wren shook her head. "I need to do this alone. He wants to meet me for lunch tomorrow at Le Bernardin, that pretentious restaurant in Manhattan where he always tried to introduce you to proper young men of society." He frowned. "The very one," she sighed. Apparently, some things never changed. The next morning, Wren nervously adjusted the navy blue midi dress that Madison had insisted she wear. Le Bernardin was packed as usual, and she spotted her uncle immediately. Marcus Cooper had a presence that commanded attention. "Wren," he stood up to greet her, his kiss on the cheek as formal as she remembered. "You look different." "I'm pregnant," she replied directly, deciding not to prolong the inevitable. Marcus took a long sip of his wine before replying, "Yes, I read about it in the social columns." Heath Sterling, "I must admit that when I suggested you look for a job more suited to your background, this wasn't exactly what I had in mind." "That's not how it happened." Wren felt her face heat up. "Heath is an honorable man, and what we have is real. As real as that story about him being sterile." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "The papers are having a field day with that bit." "I'm not going to discuss our personal lives," she replied firmly. "I came because you're my only family, Uncle Marcus. I hope you could be happy for me." Something softened in his face. "Your mother was just like that, stubborn as a mule when she believed in something. Or anyone." The mention of his mother took Wren by surprise. Marcus rarely talked about his younger sister. "Would she have supported my choices?" "Claire always followed her heart," he replied after a moment's thought. "She went against her family's wishes to marry her father, a literature professor without a penny in his pocket. But they were the happiest years of her life." Unexpected tears welled up in Wren's eyes. Pregnancy was making her emotions even more raw. "What I'm trying to say," Marcus continued, softening his tone, "is that maybe I've spent too much time trying to protect you from the kind of social scandal your mother faced, and not enough time realizing that you've inherited her ability to see what really matters." "Does that mean you approve?" "It means I'll give your Heath Sterling a chance," he smiled slightly. "And then I'd like to be a part of my future great-nephew's life, if you'll let me." Lunch continued to be lighter after that, with Marcus even showing genuine interest in the projects Wren was developing for the Sterling Foundation. When she returned to the mansion hours later, she found Heath anxiously waiting in his study. "How did it go?" he asked immediately. "Surprisingly well," she replied, dropping onto the sofa next to him. "Uncle Marcus might even attend the charity event." "Really?" He sounded genuinely surprised. The same Marcus Cooper who tried to convince you to take that job in Hong Kong last year? People can surprise you, she smiled, thinking about how her life had changed over the last few months. Sometimes they just need a chance to show their best side. Heath pulled her closer, his hand finding the familiar place on her slightly rounded belly. Speaking of surprises, Dr. Reynolds called. He wants to reschedule the ultrasound for tomorrow. Something about wanting to confirm a suspicion. Ren's heart raced. Do you think everything's all right? I'm sure it is, he reassured her, although his own eyes revealed a twinge of concern. But whatever it is, we'll face it together. Dr. Reynolds' office was strangely quiet that morning as Heath and Ren waited for the ultrasound. The doctor studied the monitor with an intense concentration that made Ren's heart race with apprehension. Well, Dr. Reynolds finally spoke, a smile spreading across his face. I think I've figured out why Mr. Sterling was able to perform his miracle. What do you mean? Heath asked, his hands squeezing Ren's. See for yourself. The doctor turned the monitor. Here's baby A. In here, he moved the transducer slightly, is baby B. The silence that followed was deafening. Ren felt the world spin for a moment as Heath seemed to have stopped breathing. Twins, she whispered, her voice trembling. Identical twins, Dr. Reynolds confirmed, which explains how they managed to beat the medical odds. The division of the egg into two embryos is a rare and completely random event. Not even your condition, Mr. Sterling, could prevent it. Heath was in shock, his eyes fixed on the screen where two small shapes pulsed in sync. Two miracles, he muttered, unshed tears glistening in his eyes. The rest of the consultation passed like a blur. Dr. Reynolds explained about the extra care needed in a twin pregnancy, scheduled more frequent follow-up appointments, and handed out a series of printed recommendations. But Ren barely registered the words, lost in the realization that she was carrying not one, but two babies. In the car, on the way back to the mansion, he finally broke the silence. Are you okay? You look a bit pale. Just processing, she replied, her hands resting protectively on her belly. Two babies, Heath. How are we going to cope? He took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a tender gesture. Together, as we've dealt with everything so far. Besides, a smile played on his lips, the mansion has enough rooms. The mention of the mansion made Ren think of something. How are we going to tell everyone? Madison will freak. As if summoned by the mention of her name, his phone rang with a message from his sister. Speak of the devil, he joked. She wants to know how the appointment went. We could have a little meeting tonight, Ren suggested. Tell everyone at once. Mrs. Patterson is already planning a special dinner anyway. Good idea. I'll invite Richard and Eleanor too. After their support this week, they deserve to know firsthand. When they arrived at the mansion, they found Madison supervising the decorations for the charity event that was to take place in a few days' time. She immediately put down her notes when she saw them. So, is everything all right with my nephew or niece? About that, Ren smiled. Can we talk over dinner? We've invited Richard and Eleanor too. Madison's eyes narrowed with suspicion. You're hiding something. Patience, little sister. Heath kissed the top of her head as he passed. Some news deserves a special moment. The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Patterson, upon hearing that there would be a special announcement, decided to prepare all of Ren's favorite dishes. Albert coordinated the arrangement of the formal dining room, while Madison alternated between overseeing the preparations for the charity event and trying to get information out of her brother. At 7 o'clock sharp, Richard and Eleanor Montgomery arrived, carrying a bouquet of orchids, Heath's mother's favorites. For the winter garden, Eleanor explained with a knowing smile, making Ren blush. Over dinner, the conversation flowed naturally, with Richard sharing stories of Heath's early days at the company and Eleanor reminiscing about moments with Elizabeth Sterling. Ren watched Heath interact with his chosen family, her heart overflowing with gratitude that they had been so welcoming to her. When dessert was served, apple pie, Mrs. Patterson's specialty, he stood up, holding Ren's hand. Well, I know you're all curious about today's appointment, he began, his barely contained smile giving away the good news. Spit it out, Heath, Madison exclaimed, making everyone laugh. Dr. Reynolds found out why we got our little miracle, Ren continued, her free hand unconsciously caressing her belly. Actually, are miracles. The silence that followed lasted only a second before Madison let out a cry of joy. Twins? You're having twins? Eleanor put her hand to her heart, tears shining in her eyes. Elizabeth always said that the Sterlings had a penchant for double surprises. That explains why you're more nauseous than usual. Mrs. Patterson commented from the dining room doorway, where she and Albert had stopped to listen to the announcement. Richard raised his glass in a toast. Elizabeth and Jonathan would be so proud. And speaking as chairman of the board, I think this definitely puts an end to any discussion about continuing the Sterling legacy. The comment provoked emotional laughter around the table. Madison was already at her tablet, making shopping lists for the baby's room. Eleanor and Mrs. Patterson were discussing special diets for twin pregnancies, while Richard and Albert were debating the need to hire more security guards. I think we've created a little chaos, Wren whispered to Heath, noting the commotion his announcement had caused. The best kind of chaos, he replied, pulling her closer. The kind that comes with a lot of love. Later, when everyone had left and the mansion was silent, he found Wren in the winter garden, admiring the newly planted orchids. What are you thinking about? He asked, hugging her from behind. About how unpredictable life is, she replied, leaning back against him. A few months ago, I was terrified of telling you about a baby. Now we're here, expecting two, with the whole family supporting us. And that's just the beginning, Heath promised, his hands resting protectively on her belly. Our best chapter is yet to come. The ballroom of the Sterling mansion was unrecognizable on the morning of the charity event. Madison had transformed the space into an elegant winter garden, inspired by her brother's love story. White orchids, Elizabeth Sterling's favorite, decorated each table, while delicate lights hung from the ceiling like stars. The reporters have already started arriving, Albert informed Heath, who was adjusting his bow tie in front of the office mirror. Miss Madison has directed them to the designated press area. In Wren, Mrs. Montgomery is with her in the master bedroom, sir. Apparently, there was a situation with the original dress. He frowned. What kind of situation? The kind that happens when you're expecting twins and your body decides to change overnight, Eleanor replied, entering the office. But don't worry, I always have a plan B. The new dress is being fitted now. Upstairs, Wren tried not to panic as Eleanor's seamstress made the final adjustments to the stunning emerald green dress. The flowing fabric elegantly disguised her 4-month belly, while the cut highlighted her shoulders in a way that made her feel confident. You look absolutely stunning, Madison declared, entering the room with a velvet box in her hands. And this will complete the look perfectly. Inside the box was a delicate emerald and diamond necklace that Wren instantly recognized from the photographs in the library. It had belonged to Elizabeth Sterling. Heath wanted to deliver it to you personally, Madison explained, but he stuck with some board members who arrived earlier. They were Mom's favorite jewels. Wren's hands trembled slightly as she touched the stones. I can't accept something so significant. Of course you can, Eleanor interjected, helping to close the necklace. Elizabeth always said that these emeralds should be worn by someone who understood the true value of the Sterling family. Not the money or the status, but the legacy of love and dedication that Jonathan and she built. The moment was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Patterson, looking worried. Sorry to interrupt, but Charlotte Astor has just arrived, and she's not alone. Who's with her? Madison asked, already reaching for her phone to manage any possible crisis. Julian Sterling. The name dropped like a bomb in the room. Julian was Heath's distant cousin, known for his attempts to question Heath's leadership of the company after the death of his parents. That's no coincidence, Eleanor muttered, her experience of social events alerting her to trouble. Charlotte and Julian have always been close, even after a breakup with Heath. Wren felt her stomach turn, and it wasn't just because of the pregnancy. Have they come to cause trouble? Don't worry, Madison assured him, already typing furiously into her phone. I'll alert security and Richard. No one's going to ruin tonight. Downstairs, Heath was genuinely surprised to see his cousin. Julian Sterling had the same aristocratic bearing as his family, but his green eyes always carried a calculating glint that Heath had learned to distrust. Cousin, Julian smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. I hope you don't mind my unannounced presence. Charlotte mentioned the event, and I thought I'd lend my family support. Of course, Heath replied diplomatically, noticing how Charlotte was watching the scene with an enigmatic smile. The foundation always appreciates additional support. Speaking of support, Charlotte interjected, her melodious voice carrying a hint of mischief. We heard the news. Twins, how wonderful, especially considering your medical history. The comment made Heath's blood boil, but years of negotiation training helped him keep his composure. Miracles do happen, Charlotte. Some of us are blessed enough to recognize them. Undoubtedly, Julian commented, sipping his champagne, although some miracles seem a little convenient. Before Heath could reply, Richard Montgomery materialized beside him. Julian, what a surprise! I was just wanting to discuss that legal opinion about your latest attempt to challenge Heath's leadership. Can we talk in private? Julian's smile faltered slightly. As Richard led him away, Eleanor and Madison descended the main staircase with Wren between them. The whole hall seemed to pause for a moment. Heath completely forgot about Charlotte and Julian when he saw Wren. Her emerald green dress flowed around her like water, and her mother's jewelry sparkled around her neck as if it had been made for her. Most importantly, there was a confidence in her bearing that made his heart swell with pride. You look absolutely stunning, he murmured when she reached him, ignoring the stares and whispers all around. Your mother's jewelry. She touched the necklace gently. Are you sure? I've never been so sure of anything in my life, he replied, offering his arm. Ready to show everyone the future of the Sterling Foundation? Wren nodded, taking a deep breath. She could feel the glances from Charlotte and Julian. She could hear the whispers from the guests, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the work she had been doing over the last few months, the projects that would transform lives, and the man by her side who believed in her unconditionally. Yes, she replied, a genuine smile lighting up her face. I'm ready for anything. Wren's speech about the Sterling Foundation's new projects was met with a wave of enthusiastic applause. Her presentation on the literacy program in underprivileged communities had touched the hearts of those present, especially when she related the initiative to Elizabeth Sterling's legacy as a teacher. Your girlfriend certainly knows how to win over an audience, Julian commented acidly to Heath, who was watching Wren with evident pride. It almost makes you forget that until a few months ago, she was serving drinks at these same events. She never served drinks, Julian, Heath replied without taking his eyes off Wren. And if you paid attention to the board reports, you know that she has a master's degree in social project management. Across the hall, Charlotte Astor circulated among the guests like an elegant snake, dropping strategic comments about Wren's surprising pregnancy and the miracle of the twins. Her tactics didn't go unnoticed by Madison, who quickly mobilized her network of social influencers to counteract the rumors. Don't let them get to you, Eleanor advised Wren, noticing her paleness after a private round of whispering. Remember that Elizabeth faced the same kind of resistance? It's different, Wren sighed, unconsciously stroking her belly. Elizabeth was a university professor when she met Jonathan. I was the housekeeper. And now you're the woman who's carrying the future of the Sterling family. Eleanor smiled, adjusting the emerald necklace around Wren's neck. What's more, you've just secured $500,000 in donations for the literacy project. That's more than Charlotte managed in all her years as chair of the events committee. The mention of the amount made Wren smile. The project was her baby as much as the twins she was carrying, and its success meant that hundreds of children would have access to quality education. The evening progressed elegantly when Richard Montgomery took to the small stage to make a special announcement. Heath joined Wren, his hand finding hers instinctively. As chairman of the board of Sterling Enterprises, Richard began, his voice commanding immediate attention. I'm pleased to announce some significant changes to our organizational structure. Julian straightened visibly, his eyes shining with barely contained anticipation. Charlotte also approached the stage, a calculated smile on her perfectly painted lips. After detailed analysis and a unanimous vote by the board, Richard continued, we have decided to expand our social responsibility division. The Sterling Foundation will be elevated to a prominent position within the group, with its own budget and administrative autonomy. Murmurs of approval ran through the room. Wren felt Heath's hand squeeze hers gently, To lead this new phase, Richard smiled directly at where they stood. We are pleased to announce Ren Cooper as our new Executive Director of Social Projects, reporting directly to the board. The announcement was greeted with enthusiastic applause. Although Ren could see Julian turn pale and Charlotte drop her glass of champagne, that wasn't in the plans, she whispered to Heath as she accepted the guest compliments. Actually, it was, he confessed with a smile. Richard and I have been discussing it for weeks. Your work over the last few months has proved that you're the right person for the job. Before Ren could reply, Julian approached them, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. Congratulations, cousin. I hope your condition doesn't interfere with your new responsibilities. The twins will be a blessing, not a hindrance, Heath replied firmly. Just as they were for Elizabeth when she was pregnant with me and continued teaching. The mention of Elizabeth seemed to hit Julian like a physical blow. He had always resented the fact that Jonathan Sterling had chosen to marry a teacher instead of following the family arrangement that would have united him with his older sister. Charlotte chose that moment to join the conversation. Speaking of Elizabeth, she remarked casually, I've always found it fascinating how she managed to balance career and family, especially considering her modest background. Elizabeth Sterling turned the foundation into what it is today. Eleanor interjected, appearing as if by magic at Ren's side. And I'm sure she would be proud to see her legacy continued by someone who shares her values and vision. The rest of the evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Madison ensured that Julian and Charlotte were kept busy with other guests, while Ren received congratulations and discussed future projects with potential donors. Later, as the last guest departed and the mansion began to fall silent, he found Ren in the winter garden, where it had all begun. Are you all right? He asked, noticing her tiredness. Tired, but happy, she replied, leaning back against him. Even with all Julian and Charlotte's attempts to ruin the evening, we achieved something important today. We achieved a lot more than that. He smiled, his hands finding the familiar place on her belly. We proved that the Sterling legacy isn't about blood or social status. It's about family, dedication, and love. Ren closed her eyes, letting his words wrap around her like a comforting blanket. The babies seemed more active tonight, as if they were also celebrating the day's victories. Do you think your mother would approve? She asked softly. Not just the babies, but all of this? She would have loved you, Heath replied without hesitation. Actually, Eleanor told me something interesting today. Apparently, Mom had a saying, the true power of the Sterling is not in building empires, but in building bridges between people. And that's exactly what we're going to do, Ren smiled, touching the emerald necklace that now bore not only Elizabeth's legacy, but also her own promises for the future. The news of Ren's promotion spread through Greenwich's social circles like fire through dry straw. While some celebrated the meteoric rise of the former governess, others, led by Julian Sterling and Charlotte Astor, fed increasingly insidious rumors about her convenient twin pregnancy. Ignore the tabloids, Madison insisted, throwing the gossip magazines into the fireplace in Heath's office on a particularly cold October morning. They always need a dramatic story to sell. Ren, now 5 months pregnant, watched the pages turn to ash. Her new position as Executive Director of Social Projects kept her too busy to worry about gossip, but the occasional nasty innuendo found its way into her heart. Actually, she commented, stroking her increasingly visible belly, I'm more worried about the outcome of Heath's meeting with the investors in Chicago. As if summoned by her words, Heath entered the office, his expression unreadable. Madison and Ren exchanged apprehensive glances. So, Madison broke the silence first. A slow smile spread across Heath's face. We did it. The Foundation's expansion project was approved unanimously. The news was extraordinary. The plan developed by Ren to expand the literacy centers to 5 different states had met with initial resistance from some more conservative investors. But how? Ren asked, as Heath wrapped her in a careful hug. I thought Mr. Donovan was adamant about the budget. Apparently, Heath explained, his daughter is a volunteer at one of our pilot centers in Boston. She convinced him about the real impact of the project. Madison was already at her tablet, organizing the communication strategy. This deserves a proper celebration. And speaking of celebrations, She cast a meaningful glance at her brother. Heath snorted nervously. Yes, well, about that. Wren, how about a walk in the garden? The winter garden was especially beautiful that morning, with the orchids in full bloom and the autumn light filtering through the glass roof. The place carried even more significance now, being not only where their story began, but also where they regularly had their ultrasound scans, since Dr. Reynolds had suggested minimizing Wren's outings due to the delicate nature of a twin pregnancy. "You're making me nervous," Wren commented, noticing how restless Heath looked. "Sorry," he smiled, guiding her to her favorite bench. "It's just that, well, I had planned something more elaborate, but after everything we've been through in the last few months, I've realized that the most important thing is to just be us." Before Wren could fully process his words, Heath knelt down in front of her, pulling a small velvet box out of his pocket. "The ring was my grandmother's," he explained, opening the box to reveal a delicate Art Deco solitaire. "She gave it to my mother, who always said it should belong to someone who understood that true love isn't measured by social status or other people's expectations." Tears began to form in Wren's eyes, and she partly attributed them to pregnancy hormones. "Heath, let me finish," he smiled, taking her hand. "Wren Cooper, you came into my life as an organizing force, not just of my home, but of my heart. You gave me not just one, but two miracles when I had given up dreaming about them. More than that, you showed me that family is not about blood or traditions, but about love, dedication, and the courage to face adversity together." A small movement in her belly made Wren smile through her tears. "I think the babies are approving of the speech." Heath rested his free hand on her belly, smiling as he felt the kicks. "So, what do you say? Do you want to make me the happiest man in the world and officially become a Sterling?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. The moment was interrupted by a small cry of joy coming from the winter garden door. Madison was there, along with Eleanor, Richard, Mrs. Patterson, and Albert, all with beaming expressions. "I'm sorry," Madison wiped away a tear, "but we couldn't miss it. Did you know?" Wren asked, as Heath slid the ring onto her finger. "Honey, we all knew," Eleanor smiled. "He'd spent the last week rehearsing the speech for anyone who would listen." "And some who didn't," Albert added with his characteristic dry humor. Mrs. Patterson was already talking about the menu for the engagement dinner, while Madison began listing possible dates and venues for the wedding. Richard and Eleanor exchanged knowing glances, remembering another Sterling couple who had defied social expectations for love. "By the way," Heath mentioned casually as he helped Wren to her feet, "since we're all here, Dr. Reynolds sent us the results of the last test." Everyone froze, attentive. Twin pregnancies required constant monitoring, and each test was awaited with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "They're girls," Wren announced, her smile lighting up the whole room. "Two perfectly healthy girls." The announcement was greeted with a fresh wave of excitement. Madison was already planning an elaborate baby shower, while Eleanor muttered something about needing to find more family jewelry suitable for two Sterling heiresses. That evening, after everyone had left and the mansion was silent, he found Wren in her, now their bedroom, organizing some baby clothes that Madison had insisted on buying. "Happy?" he asked, hugging her from behind. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning back against him. "Although I still find it surreal that in a few months we'll be the parents of two girls, who will no doubt be as organized and determined as their mother," he joked. "And as stubborn as their father," she added, turning in his arms to face him. "Do you really not care that they're girls? I know there's the whole Sterling name thing. What matters to me is that they're healthy and loved," he replied with conviction. "Besides, something tells me that our daughters are going to completely redefine what it means to be a Sterling." The news of Heath Sterling's engagement to his former housekeeper dominated Greenwich's social headlines, but was eclipsed by the even more surprising revelation. The heirs to the Sterling Empire would be two girls. Julian Sterling couldn't hide his disgust during the emergency board meeting called to discuss the implications of this news for the future of the company. "Two girls," he repeated, his tone distilling venom. "And how exactly do you plan to maintain the Sterling legacy through?" "Well," Richard Montgomery, who was chairing the meeting, removed his glasses with deliberate slowness. Julian, this is the 21st century. The sterling legacy doesn't depend on the gender of your heirs, but on their leadership skills and commitment to the company's values. Meanwhile, at the Sterling Foundation, Wren was facing her own challenges. The expansion of the literacy program demanded her full attention, but preparations for the wedding and the increasingly obvious pregnancy made it difficult to keep up the usual pace. "You need to slow down," Madison insisted, finding Wren asleep on a pile of reports in her office. "The doctors have been clear about adequate rest in twin pregnancies." "I just need to finalize the presentation for the new partners in Boston," Wren muttered, trying to focus her eyes on the computer screen. "How about a deal?" Madison proposed, taking a seat on the edge of the table. "You go home and rest now, and I'll finish the presentation. In return, you let me organize your baby's shower without complaining about the number of guests." Madison's conspiratorial smile made Wren laugh. "You're already organizing the baby's shower regardless of my opinion." "True, but now I have your official blessing." At home, Wren found Heath in a tense video conference with international investors. He paused when he saw her enter, his eyes immediately noticing her tiredness. "Gentlemen, I need to wrap up here," he declared, ignoring the protests of the executives on the screen. "We have an unavoidable appointment with Dr. Reynolds." After disconnecting the call, Heath approached Wren, his concern evident. "You look pale." "I'm fine," she tried to assure him, but a slight tremor in her legs betrayed her. Heath led her gently to the sofa, his large, warm hands finding the points of tension in her shoulders. "Dr. Reynolds called earlier. He wants to see us early tomorrow morning." "Did something happen?" Wren felt her heart racing. No, he reassured her quickly. "Apparently, our little Sterling is developing so well that he wants to bring forward some tests." The use of the surname Sterling to refer to the babies still caused a surge of emotion in Wren. It was a constant reminder of how drastically her life had changed in the last year. "Speaking of Sterling," she hesitated, "Eleanor mentioned something about a family naming tradition." He smiled, his hands reaching down to caress the prominent belly where his daughters were actively moving. "Yes, the firstborn Sterling children are usually given names that begin with E, in honor of the first Elizabeth Sterling, who founded the foundation. And you want to maintain this tradition?" "Only if you agree," he replied sincerely. "Our daughters will write their own history, regardless of their names." At that moment, one of the babies kicked particularly hard, making them both laugh. "I think someone has an opinion on that," Wren commented. The evening was progressing when Eleanor arrived unannounced, carrying a familiar-looking antique box. "I found these in the attic of the Montgomery mansion," she explained, taking a careful seat next to Wren. "It's Elizabeth Sterling's diaries." Heath watched as Wren reverently opened the first volume, her hands tracing the elegant calligraphy on the first page. "Dear daughters," she read aloud, "if you ever read these pages, I want you to know that being a Sterling is not about being born in a privilege, but about creating privilege for others." The words seemed to span decades, connecting past and present in a deeply meaningful way. Eleanor smiled, noticing the tears in Wren's eyes. "Elizabeth wrote those diaries when she found out she was pregnant with Heath," she explained. "She faced a lot of resistance at the time, just like you, but she turned every criticism into motivation to make a difference." "How did she do it?" Wren asked softly, thinking of Julian and his allies on the council. "The same way you're doing it," Eleanor replied with conviction. "With grace, determination, and the kind of strength that comes not from the name we bear, but from the love we choose to give." The discovery of Elizabeth Sterling's diaries triggered a series of subtle changes at the mansion. Wren spent hours immersed in the yellowed pages, finding comfort and inspiration in the words of the first Sterling matriarch who, like her, had faced resistance when bringing new ideas to the family. "I found something interesting," she commented to Heath one particularly cold November morning, as they shared breakfast in the winter garden. "Your mother wrote about a special tradition for Sterling babies." Heath paused his reading of the Wall Street Journal, puzzled. "What tradition?" "Apparently, each Sterling baby receives a meaningful gift from every close family member, something that represents a wish or hope for their future." "Ah, yes," he smiled, memories of family stories resurfacing. "Madison got a little old typewriter from our father. He said she'd be a storyteller." And look at her now, managing all the communication for the Sterling Empire. Wren smiled, stroking her prominent belly where the twins were actively moving. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Madison, who entered carrying several folders and her inseparable tablet. "We need to discuss the official announcement of the names," she declared, sitting down unceremoniously. "The press has been speculating wildly ever since Julian let slip about the tradition." Wren and Heath exchanged glances. They had decided on the names the night before, after hours of rereading Elizabeth's diaries and talking about the legacy they wanted to pass on to their daughters. "Eleanor Rose and Emma Grace Sterling," Wren announced softly. Madison let out a small, emotional sigh. "Eleanor, as in Anne Eleanor? In Emma, as the first teacher who worked with Elizabeth at the foundation," Heath added. "We found a story in the diaries. Emma Thompson dedicated 50 years of her life teaching underprivileged children through the foundation's programs." "It's perfect," Madison declared, already typing notes on her tablet. "I'll prepare the official statement." And speaking of official, she hesitated briefly. "Julian is calling another extraordinary board meeting." He frowned. "What's the excuse this time?" "He's questioning the legitimacy of the foundation's expansion under Wren's leadership, claiming a conflict of interest due to the engagement." Before Heath could answer, Wren put a hand on his arm. "Let him try. The numbers speak for themselves. The literacy program has already exceeded all targets for the quarter. And I have more ammunition." Madison smiled mischievously. "I found out that Charlotte has been in frequent contact with competing investors. Richard is already preparing a dossier on possible breaches of confidentiality." The arrival of Eleanor Montgomery interrupted the discussion. She was carrying an antique jewelry box that Wren recognized as belonging to her family. "Sorry to intrude," Eleanor smiled, "but I needed to deliver this today." She opened the box, revealing 2 delicate sapphire brooches in the shape of butterflies. Elizabeth wore these the day she officially took over as president of the foundation. She always said that butterflies represent transformation and hope. "They're beautiful," Wren whispered, touching the jewelry gently. "They're for the girls," Eleanor explained. "My gift to Eleanor Rose and Emma Grace. To remind them that transformation isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." The moment was interrupted by Albert, who rushed in, something rare for the ever-composed butler. "Mr. Sterling, pardon the interruption, but Dr. Reynolds is on the phone. It's urgent." Wren's heart raced when Heath answered the call. The latest scans had shown that one of the twins was slightly smaller than the other, although the doctor had assured her that it was within the normal range for identical twins. "Yes, doctor." Heath spoke, his expression unreadable. "I see. Yes, we'll be there in an hour." "What's wrong?" Wren asked as soon as he hung up. "He wants to do an emergency ultrasound," Heath explained, trying to keep his voice calm. "He noticed something in the last test that he wanted to check out in person." Madison was already grabbing her car keys, while Eleanor was making calls to reschedule the day's appointments. Mrs. Patterson magically appeared with a cooler bag containing snacks and water. She insisted that Wren needed to eat regularly, especially in times of stress. On the way to the hospital, Wren held Heath's hand tightly, both lost in thought and worry. The pages of Elizabeth's diary seemed to echo in his mind. The true test of a Sterling is not in how we face success, but in how we face the challenges that life presents us with. Dr. Reynolds was waiting for them in his office, his professional expression masking any emotion. As he prepared the ultrasound equipment, he explained that he had noticed a possible complication in the blood flow between the twins. "It's a condition that requires constant monitoring," he explained, moving the transducer over Wren's belly. "But detected in time, it can be managed successfully." The next few minutes were the longest in Heath and Wren's lives. The sound of the twins' heartbeats filled the room as Dr. Reynolds intently studied the images on the screen. The silence in Dr. Reynolds' office was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the twins' heartbeats. Wren held Heath's hand tightly as the doctor continued his thorough examination, his experienced eyes studying every detail on the ultrasound screen. "Well," Dr. Reynolds finally said, a small smile appearing on his face, "it looks like our little Sterling girls are as determined as their parents. The blood flow is already normalizing." The tension in the room dissipated instantly. Madison, who had insisted on waiting in the next room, burst into the office at the first sign of good news. "So my nieces are fine?" she asked, already teary-eyed. "They're responding positively to the treatment we started last week," the doctor confirmed. "However," he turned to Wren, "this means absolute bed rest until the end of the pregnancy. No office, meetings, or social events." Heath nodded gravely. "I'll personally make sure she follows all the recommendations." "But the Boston project," Wren began to protest. "It can be managed remotely," Madison promptly intervened. "I've already installed the entire video conferencing system in your room, and Eleanor has offered to personally oversee the inaugurations of the new centers." Their return to the mansion was met with a mixture of relief and concern for the little family they had built. Mrs. Patterson had already transformed the master bedroom into a veritable sanctuary of comfort, with strategically placed cushions and a tray of chamomile tea waiting. "Little ones need reassurance," she declared with her motherly authority, helping Wren to settle down. "And you, Mr. Sterling, need to deal with that cousin of yours before he causes any more unnecessary stress." Heath kissed Wren's forehead before heading to his office, where Richard Montgomery was waiting with news of Julian's latest moves. "He's trying to call an extraordinary shareholders meeting," Richard informed him, his expression serious. "Apparently, Charlotte has managed to gather some supporters among the more conservative investors." "What's the allegation this time?" Heath asked, his voice heavy with fatigue. "They're questioning female leadership in the company, using Wren's pregnancy as an example of emotional instability." Richard practically spat out the last words. As if Elizabeth hadn't proved decades ago that this kind of thinking is ridiculous. Upstairs, Wren was once again leafing through Elizabeth's diaries, finding strength in the words of a woman who had faced similar challenges. One passage in particular caught her eye. "True power lies not in winning every battle, but in choosing which ones are worth fighting. Some victories come from silence, from patience, from the ability to wait for the right moment." Eleanor, who had arrived for her daily visit, noticed the passage Wren was reading. She wrote this when she was on bed rest, pregnant with Heath. The board tried to remove her from the foundation, claiming that a risky pregnancy made her emotionally unstable. "And how did she respond?" Wren asked, settling back against the pillows. "In the most Elizabethan way possible," Eleanor smiled. "By using her time off to develop the program that revolutionized the early childhood education system in the region. When she returned 3 months later, she presented a plan so well structured that not even her staunchest opponents could question it." The conversation was interrupted by Madison, who entered carrying her laptop. "I've just received the latest reports from Boston. Enrollment in the literacy program tripled after the last campaign." "See?" Eleanor smiled at Wren. "Some battles are won from bed." Over the next few days, the master bedroom of the Sterling mansion was transformed into a makeshift command center. Madison installed monitors that allowed Wren to participate virtually in important meetings, while Eleanor personally coordinated visits to the news centers, always broadcasting live so that Wren could follow every detail. Heath, for his part, was facing his own battles on the council. Julian's attempt to call an extraordinary meeting had failed spectacularly when Richard presented evidence of Charlotte's irregular dealings with competing companies. "She's being removed from the board," he informed Wren one evening as they shared a dinner specially prepared by Mrs. Patterson. And Julian, "Well, let's just say he's finally understood that his time of influence is over." "What do you mean?" Wren asked, noticing a special twinkle in her fiancé's eyes. Eleanor found some interesting documents in the company's old archives. Apparently, Elizabeth had foreseen this kind of situation. She included a clause in the foundation statutes that gives absolute priority of succession to the Sterling line, regardless of gender. "So our daughters, they're the rightful heirs not only to the Sterling name, but to the entire legacy Elizabeth built," Heath added, his hand finding the familiar spot on Wren's belly where Eleanor Rose and Emma Grace were actively moving. "Your mother thought of everything." Wren smiled, touched. "She knew that one day the family would need a new Elizabeth Sterling," Heath replied softly. "Or rather, two." The morning that marked the arrival of the Sterling twins began with a soft December snow covering Greenwich in a blanket of white. Wren woke with light contractions. watching the flakes through the master bedroom windows while Heath still slept beside her. The last 2 months of absolute rest had been an exercise in patience and transformation. Dr. Reynolds had scheduled a C-section for the following week, but Eleanor Rose and Emma Grace, proving once again to be true Sterling, had other plans. When the contractions began to intensify, Wren gently woke Heath. "Is it time?" he asked, instantly alert. "I think your daughters have decided they don't want to miss Christmas," she smiled, trying to mask her anxiety. The mansion quickly came to life. Madison, who had practically moved into the guest room since the doctor ordered strict bed rest, was already on the phone to the hospital. Mrs. Patterson was preparing a bag of specially chosen snacks, while Albert was coordinating logistics with the security team. "Richard and Eleanor are on their way to the hospital," Madison informed them, helping Wren get dressed. "And Uncle Marcus just landed in his private helicopter. Apparently he canceled an important meeting in Chicago to be here." The news surprised Wren. Her uncle had shown a remarkable change of attitude in recent weeks, especially after reading Elizabeth Sterling's diaries that Eleanor had shared with him. At the hospital, the medical team was already prepared. Dr. Reynolds, noticing Wren's blood pressure rising, decided not to wait any longer. "Let's go and meet the little Sterling girls right now." Heath, dressed in his surgical uniform, held Wren's hand tightly as she was prepared for surgery. "Remember the first time we met?" he asked, trying to distract her. "How could I forget?" She smiled to her nervousness. "You were so lost among those piles of documents in the office. And you reorganized everything in less than a day, creating a system that I still use today," he added, his eyes shining with love and admiration. The operating room was silent, except for the sounds of medical equipment and Dr. Reynolds' gentle instructions. At 9:47 a.m., Eleanor Rose Sterling came into the world with a loud cry that made Heath's eyes fill with tears. 3 minutes later, Emma Grace followed, her voice softer but just as determined. "They're perfect," Heath whispered, watching the nurses clean and weigh his daughters. "Just like you." In the corridor, the family waited anxiously. Madison filmed everything for posterity, while Eleanor Montgomery held the butterfly brooches that would be the girls' first present. Marcus Cooper, surprisingly emotional, shared stories with Richard about his sister, Wren's mother, and how she would have loved this moment. When the twins were finally presented to the family, there was a moment of reverent silence. Eleanor Rose, with a small crescent-shaped birthmark near her shoulder, seemed to study everyone with her attentive eyes. Emma Grace, slightly smaller but equally alert, gripped Madison's finger tightly as soon as she approached. "Elizabeth would be so proud," Eleanor whispered, gently touching the newborn's cheeks. "They have that same sparkle in their eyes." Over the next few days, the Sterling mansion was transformed to welcome its newest residents. Heath and Madison's old playroom was converted into a fairy tale nursery, with paintings of butterflies on the walls, a surprise organized by Marcus, who secretly hired a famous artist for the project. A week after the twins' birth, he found Wren in the winter garden, breastfeeding Eleanor Rose while Emma Grace slept peacefully in her nearby crib. Elizabeth's orchids were in full bloom, as if celebrating the arrival of the new Sterling girls. "I found this in the study," he said softly, handing Wren an aged envelope. "It was kept with my mother's diaries." Inside was a letter, dated the day Elizabeth discovered her pregnancy. "To future Sterling generations, the true power of our family has never been in the buildings we have built or the fortunes we have amassed. It lies in the ability to see beyond appearances, to find value where others see only conventions to be followed. When I fell in love with Jonathan, many said that a teacher couldn't carry the Sterling name with dignity. Today, as I write this carrying a new life inside me, I know I was right to follow my heart. To whoever is reading this letter, remember that being Sterling is more than a name. It's a responsibility to those who need hope, opportunities, a chance to transform their lives. Love, Elizabeth Sterling." Wren felt silent tears run down her face as Heath gently picked Eleanor Rose up to make her burp. Emma Grace chose that moment to wake up, her little fists waving in the air until Wren picked her up. "I think they already know," Heath commented, observing how the twins seemed to calm down instantly in their parents' arms. "Know what?" that they're part of something bigger, that they carry not just a name, but a legacy of love, courage, and transformation. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing Greenwich in promises of new beginnings. In the Sterling mansion, two little heiresses slept peacefully, protected by the love of their parents and the legacy of a woman who, decades before, dared to redefine what it meant to be a Sterling. The future, with all its challenges and possibilities, awaited. But for now, in that winter garden where it all began, a new family was celebrating its own miracle. Not one, but two, and the certainty that love, when true, always finds its way.